Long before white sails appeared on the horizon, these lands were home to magnificent civilizations. Stone cities rose on the cloud-touching peaks of the Andes Mountains. Pyramids reached toward the sky in the heart of Yucatan's forests. In a glorious capital built upon lakes, thousands of people lived in peace. This was not a new world waiting to be discovered. This was the homeland of ancient civilizations that wrote their own calendars, calculated the positions of stars, skillfully worked the land, and laid thousands of kilometers of roads across vast, rugged terrain. But then everything changed with the arrival of strangers from the sea. This encounter, which began in the shadow of the sword, the cross, and the lust for gold, did not merely topple empires. It virtually rewrote the fate of a continent. Borders drawn in blood, orders established by force, and unsilenceable memories shaped the face of Latin America as we know it today. In this video, we will not tell the story solely through the lens of conquest and resistance. Together, we will discover how this great collision that began 500 years ago left a legacy to today's inequalities, economic dependencies, and still living cultural identities. Chapter 1. Before the ships on the horizon. The glory of pre-Columbian civilizations. To understand how a continent was destroyed, one must first know how high it fell from. The Europeans who came to Latin America did not encounter empty lands. Before them stood cities, empires, and a memory thousands of years old. In the humid forests of Central America, stone pyramids rose to the sky. The Maya, organized as city-states, were a civilization that read the sky like a book. They were advanced in mathematics, for instance. They knew the concept of zero. They tracked the movements of planets with precise calculations and measured time with complex calendars. For them, the universe was a sacred order that determined everything from architecture to agriculture. To the north, in the Valley of Mexico, a completely different landscape stretched out. The city of Tenochtitlan, rising in the middle of a lake. With streets divided by canals, temples, and a population exceeding 100,000, it was one of the largest metropolises of its time. The Aztecs had built a powerful, centralized empire. Their wealth came from conquests, plunder, and the tributes they collected. But this power also accumulated deep resentment among indigenous peoples. To the south, along the Andes Mountains, the Incas ruled over harsh geography. Without using the wheel, they laid thousands of kilometers of roads connecting mountains to one another. They prevented famines through storage networks, developed irrigation systems, and constructed massive structures. Machu Picchu, hidden among the clouds, was a silent witness to this advanced engineering and organization. Yet it would be a mistake to romanticize this world. These civilizations were not perfect either. Rigid hierarchies, forced labor, harsh governance, and internal conflicts were part of daily life. The American continent was neither a pristine paradise nor an ideal society. It was a world built upon powerful but fragile balances. And right in the midst of these balances, one day foreign sailing ships appeared on the horizon. From that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 2. The Collision of Worlds. Not discovery, but encounter. At the end of the 15th century, two worlds that had lived completely separate from each other for thousands of years suddenly and violently came together. To describe this event as a Europe-centered discovery means ignoring the existence of millions of people living on the American continent and what this contact meant to them. What happened was not so much a discovery as an irreversible collision of two different biological and cultural ecosystems. Let us now take a close look at the causes of this encounter and the devastating consequences it created for indigenous societies. 15th century Europe was economically squeezed by the weakening of traditional trade routes, especially the Silk Road. For competing kingdoms seeking new resources, overseas explorations had become a necessity. Christopher Columbus's voyage was less an individual story of courage than a consequence of this global desire for expansion. Behind this exploration movement lay three fundamental motivations: the desire to find new trade routes to reach Asia's riches, the goal of establishing political superiority over rival kingdoms, and the mission to spread Christianity, Pachacuti, the overturning of the world. This process, which Europeans called conquest, carried a much deeper meaning in the language of Andean peoples, Pachacuti. This concept expressed not just an invasion, but the overturning of the order of time, space, and the world itself. This encounter was not merely a conflict between armies. Societies that had lived completely isolated from each other for thousands of years were also biologically defenseless, and this vulnerability exponentially increased the scale of the catastrophe. The invisible enemy, the devastation of diseases. The most lethal weapon of the conquest was not the Spaniards' steel swords or gunpowder weapons. What brought true devastation were invisible enemies. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which Europeans had gained immunity, were completely unknown on the American continent. These epidemics led to the disappearance of indigenous populations in some regions at rates reaching up to 90%. This was a demographic collapse rarely seen in history. A single viral epidemic caused more deaths than those massacred in wars. After this great biological and cultural shock, the following question arose: how could European groups, numerically so small, change the fate of such massive civilizations? This question would open the most dramatic and darkest pages of the conquests. Chapter 3: The Fall of Empires, Betrayal, Strategy, and Destruction. One of history's most astonishing questions is this: vast empires where millions lived, armies with tens of thousands of soldiers, how were they destroyed so quickly by a few hundred Europeans? The answer lies not only in the power of gunpowder and steel. What was truly decisive was intelligence, manipulation, and an order that dissolved from within. These conquests were not the story of small armies coming from outside, but of empires that collapsed from within. Cortés and the Fall of the Aztecs, a war of alliances. When Hernán Cortés landed on the Mexican coast in 1519 with only a few hundred soldiers, he faced a massive world. Winning in a direct war was impossible. So he chose a different path. Instead of multiplying his enemies, he found his enemies' enemies and formed alliances with them. The Aztec Empire's heavy tribute system and harsh rule had exhausted many indigenous communities. Indigenous peoples formed temporary alliances with the Spaniards to escape this oppressive order. For peoples like the Tlaxcalans, the Spaniards were not saviors, but a temporary weapon to use against the Aztecs. Thus, the conquest would occur not as a direct clash between Europeans and indigenous peoples, but as a civil war in which indigenous peoples also took sides. Another critical element was communication. Malinche, a woman of Nahua origin. She was a translator, but much more than that. She translated not only words, but cultures and intentions. She opened doors of diplomacy to Cortés, made alliances possible, and warned of traps in advance. And perhaps more effective than all of this in the realization of the conquest was the leadership's short-sightedness. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma was indecisive. Was Cortés a god, an envoy, or an enemy? He could never clearly oppose Cortés. This hesitation bought the Spaniards time. Sometimes what destroys an empire is not a sword, but a delayed decision. In the end, Tenochtitlan fell. The once glorious capital turned into ruins. Pizarro and the Incas. The collapse had already begun. When Francisco Pizarro reached the Andes, the Inca Empire was already bleeding. An epidemic disease had killed the emperor, and then a devastating war of succession had begun between his sons Atahualpa and Huáscar. The army was divided, the country exhausted. Pizarro arrived right in the middle of this chaos. In 1532, he invited Emperor Atahualpa to Cajamarca under the pretense of a meeting. The unarmed Inca delegation was ambushed. Within minutes, thousands of soldiers were killed. The emperor was taken prisoner. For a centralized system, this was a paralyzing blow. Because in the Inca order, the emperor was not merely a ruler, but the representative of cosmic order. Atahualpa offered enough gold and silver to fill a room for his freedom. Chests full of gold and silver were delivered. But Pizarro did not keep his word. He executed the emperor. This was not just an execution. The moral foundation of a world collapsed. In an order based on the sanctity of one's word, the psychological devastation created by betrayal tore apart resistance from within. The empire disintegrated along with its leader. When the conquest was completed, not even ruins remained. Temples were dismantled. Churches were built with their stones. One faith was buried in the foundation of another. This was no longer just a military victory. It was the systematic erasure of a memory, a worldview. And now there was another stage ahead. How these lands were transformed into a massive wealth-generating machine, and how the exploitative order that was established changed the entire world. Chapter 4: Colonial Order, Silver, Blood, and a New Society. When the war ended, everything did not end. The real order was just beginning. Mine shafts replaced swords. Ledgers replaced conquests. For approximately 300 years, Latin America meant only one thing to the Spanish and Portuguese empires: minerals to be extracted, land to be worked, labor to be consumed. A continent was transformed into a massive production machine, and the heart of this order beat in the Andes, Potosí. This silver mountain rising in present-day Bolivia became one of the world's richest mines when discovered in the 16th century. The silver extracted from here financed wars in Europe, filled the treasuries of kings, transformed Spain into a global power. The first global trade networks were established thanks to this mine. But this wealth had a price. Thousands of indigenous people and enslaved people forcibly brought from Africa were made to work in narrow tunnels amid toxic dust without seeing daylight. Most never returned. Potosí was not just a silver mountain. It was a machine that ground human lives. Europe's prosperity was financed with America's blood. This order was not accidental. It was systematic. The Spaniards established the encomienda system to control indigenous labor. On paper, protection and Christianization were promised. In reality, there were heavy taxes, forced labor, and virtually slavery. The Incas' old mita system was also reorganized. It was no longer public service, but a mechanism for supplying workers to the mines. The result was always the same: high mortality rates, emptied villages, scattered communities. However, the colonial period changed not only the economy, but also the people. Europeans came. Indigenous peoples tried to survive. Millions of people were brought in chains from Africa. This encounter created the complex identity that Latin America still carries today. A new society was being born, mestizos. But this mixing did not bring equality. On the contrary, a rigid hierarchy based on race was established. At the top were those born in Spain peninsulares. Below them were Spaniards born in America criollos. Further down were mixed-race people, indigenous people, and Africans. Skin color and place of birth determined one's fate. You could be wealthy, but still could not govern. Especially for the criollos, this exclusion was sowing the seeds of anger that would later explode. The first sparks of independence movements began to accumulate right here. One of the most powerful actors of this order was also the Catholic Church. On one hand, it became the ideological foundation of the conquests. Christianity legitimized the colonial system through its discourse of obedience and order. On the other hand, some clergymen, for example, Bartolomé de las Casas, opposed the atrocities committed against indigenous peoples and raised their voices. The church was both part of the order and, at times, its conscience. That is why its legacy is still full of contradictions. For 300 years, this rigid and unequal order continued almost unchanged. But across the ocean, in Europe, new ideas were sprouting. And before long, these ideas would reach Latin America and shake the continent once again. Chapter 5. Winds of Independence and Shattered Dreams. For 300 years, the continent worked silently. Mines were dug, fields were plowed, but the wealth produced did not benefit the continent. But at a certain point, the question became inevitable. For whom were these lands producing? By the end of the 18th century, a new wind began to blow in Latin America. This time it was not soldiers arriving on ships, but ideas, liberty, sovereignty, equality. On the other side of the Atlantic, the American and French revolutions were taking place, and the divine right of kings was being questioned. Enlightenment thought was shaking empires to their foundations. These ideas most affected one group stuck in the middle of colonial society, the criollos. They were wealthy. Land, trade, fortune were in their hands, but power was never theirs. The highest positions were always reserved for those who came from Spain. The demand for independence was therefore not only a quest for freedom, but also a desire to take power from the Europeans. In 1808, Napoleon's invasion of Spain left the empire without a center. The Spanish throne was vacant. Authority had collapsed, and for the first time in centuries, the continent had the opportunity to determine its own fate. Uprisings began. In the north, Simón Bolívar. In the south, José de San Martín. Two names, two armies, one goal: to end Spanish rule. They crossed the Andes with their soldiers. This was perhaps one of the most difficult military campaigns in history. Icy passes, hunger, disease. But in the end, victory came. Battles were won, one by one. Spanish flags were lowered. New republics were declared. On paper, the continent was now free. But for the person on the street, how much had life changed? Indigenous peoples were still tied to the land. Enslaved people of African descent were still in chains. The poor were still poor. The rulers of the colonial order had left, but the order itself remained largely in place. Only the actors had changed. Bolívar's dream was greater. He wanted not individual states, but a united continent. Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador. A single federation. Gran Colombia. A strong and independent Latin America. But reality was different. Local elites did not want to share their own power. Regional interests, personal ambitions, and geographic barriers prevailed. Civil wars broke out. The dream of unity quickly disintegrated. The continent was divided into dozens of small and fragile republics. Independence had come, but it brought not stability, but fragmentation. Political chains had been broken, but the land order, class divisions, and racial hierarchies remained largely the same. That is why this question began to be asked more and more loudly. Had they truly been liberated, or had their masters simply changed? The contradiction that would define Latin America's modern history was born right here. Conclusion: legacy, open wounds, and an unbowed spirit. When the independence wars ended, flags changed. Maps were redrawn. New republics were born. But some things never changed. Because colonialism was not just a form of governance. It was an order carved into the land, the economy, and minds. And that order continued to live on after independence. Latin America's story today has been shaped in the shadow of this legacy. First, the land, the latifundia system from the colonial period. The concentration of massive lands in the hands of a small elite changed hardly at all. Land remained in the hands of a few, while millions became either tenants or workers. This inequality determined the continent's fate. Rural poverty, waves of migration, endless social conflicts. Then, the economy. In the colonial period, the model was simple: send raw materials, buy manufactured goods. Independence did not break this chain. Only the address changed. Yesterday it was Spain, then England, then other global powers. Latin America, often unable to establish its own industry, continued to produce according to the needs of others on the periphery of the world economy. What many historians call neo-colonialism was precisely this: politically free, economically dependent. And politics. The independence wars placed the military at the center. Instead of strong institutions, strong men emerged. Caudillos, charismatic generals, coups, short-lived democracies. This fragility made stability difficult for centuries. Military regimes, populism, even organized crime networks flourished in this vacuum. The colonial order had gone, but the structure it left behind still shaped the system. But the story does not end here. Because Latin America is not only about wounds, it is also the continent of resistance. Languages spoken despite prohibitions, cultures that produce despite poverty, dances, music, in Pablo Neruda's verses, in Diego Rivera's murals, in the protests that fill the streets. For 500 years there has been something that cannot be suppressed, an unbowed spirit. Latin America's identity is neither entirely European, nor the shadow of a lost past. Its identity is a hybrid force born from conflicts, mixtures, and the struggle for survival. The power to transform pain into memory, memory into art, art into resistance. That is why the history of Latin America is not a story left in the past. It is a key that explains today, and perhaps a warning for building a more just future. Because this continent has been destroyed repeatedly, but each time it has risen again. The story continues still. If this narrative has given you a new perspective, don't forget to share your thoughts and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.